I agreed to sell the house on a Tuesday morning, and afterward I sat alone on the back steps and cried without making a sound. The garden was quiet. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance. I remember pressing my palms into the dirt beside me, as if the ground itself might steady me, and thinking how strange it was that the earth felt more loyal than my own child. My son had left less than an hour earlier. He stood in the doorway when he said goodbye, keys already in his hand, his body angled away from me like he was late for something more important. He did not ask if I was all right. He did not ask if I needed help with lunch. He only reminded me that the realtor would be calling soon and that I should be ready this time. When the door closed behind him, the house made a soft settling sound, the way old houses do, and for the first time it felt like it was settling without me. I am 72 years old. I have lived in this house since I was 30. I learned how to be a wife here. I learned how to be a mother here. I learned how to be alone here after my husband died. The walls know the sound of my footsteps. The windows know the shape of my shadow in the evenings. Yet suddenly, according to my son, it was no longer mine to decide. He said he was worried about me. That was always how it began. He said the house was too big, too old, too much responsibility. He said the neighborhood was changing. He said I should think about my future. When I reminded him that this house was my future, that it was the one place where I still felt anchored, he sighed the way adults do when a child refuses to listen. That sigh hurt more than any raised voice ever could. My husband's photograph still sat on the mantel that morning. I had dusted around it carefully, the way I always did, making sure not to move the frame. In the picture, Arthur was smiling, one arm around my shoulder, squinting slightly into the sun. He had been gone for 3 years, but sometimes it felt like he had just stepped into the other room. Other times, like that Tuesday, it felt like the distance between us was unbridgeable. My son talked about practicality. He talked about finances. He talked about how selling the house would make things easier for everyone. I noticed he did not say easier for me. When I asked where I was supposed to go, he said we would figure something out. The way he said it told me he already had. I made tea while he talked, pouring hot water over the leaves even though my hands were shaking. I focused on the small things, the steam rising from the cup, the familiar smell, the faint rattle of the spoon against the porcelain. These were the rituals that had carried me through grief. These were the things that reminded me I was still here. He did not notice any of it. By the time he left, I was tired in a way sleep does not fix. I sat at the kitchen table long after my tea went cold, staring at the grain in the wood. Arthur and I had sanded that table ourselves, laughing when we realized we had chosen the wrong finish and had to start over. The memory felt fragile, like something that might disappear if I held it too tightly. That was when I told myself I would agree. Not because I believed him, not because I wanted to, but because I could not bear another visit like that. I could not bear the way he looked at me, as if I were an obstacle to be managed. I thought that if I gave him what he wanted, the pressure would stop. I thought the quiet might return. I signed the papers later that afternoon, my name written carefully in the space provided. The pen felt unfamiliar in my hand, as if it belonged to someone else. When I finished, I sat there for a long time, listening to the tick of the clock on the wall. Each second felt heavier than the last. After that, I wandered through the house without purpose. I touched the door frames, the backs of chairs, the edge of the counter where Arthur used to stand and tell me stories while I cooked. Everything looked the same. That was what frightened me. Nothing had changed, yet I felt like a guest in my own life. Eventually, I went outside. The back garden had always been my refuge. Arthur used to say it was where I did my best thinking. The flower bed along the fence was overgrown, the white roses struggling under weeds I had not had the energy to pull. I knelt down, more for something to do with my hands than because I had a plan, and began to clear away the dead leaves. The soil was cool and dark beneath my fingers. It smelled the way earth should, rich and steady. For a moment, the noise in my head softened. I reminded myself that gardens, like people, could look neglected and still be alive underneath. I reminded myself of all the seasons I had already survived. As I worked, I thought about how quickly things had shifted, about how easily my son had rewritten our history, turning my memories into liabilities, about how loneliness can make you agree to things you would never accept if you felt truly seen. I wondered when exactly I had started apologizing for taking up space. My knee pressed against something solid beneath the soil. At first, I thought it was a rock. The garden had plenty of those. I brushed the dirt aside absently, my mind elsewhere, until my fingers touched a smooth edge that did not feel like stone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat for reasons I could not yet explain. I told myself it was nothing, old pipes maybe, debris from when Arthur and I first dug the bed years ago. Still, my hand lingered there, tracing the outline beneath the dirt. The feeling was unfamiliar enough to make my stomach tighten. I sat back on my heels and looked at the house, at the windows reflecting the afternoon light. For the first time since my son left, I felt something other than sadness. It was small and unformed, but it was there. A sense that agreeing to sell might not be the end of my story after all. I did not dig any further that day. I covered the spot again carefully, smoothing the soil as if nothing had happened. But as I went back inside, I could not shake the feeling that the garden was holding its breath, and that whatever lay beneath the roses had been waiting a very long time for me to notice. That night, sleep did not come easily. I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the distant hum of traffic, the soft creak of wood adjusting to the cooler air. These noises had once comforted me. They reminded me that the house was alive, that it breathed alongside me. Now they only emphasized how empty it had become. Arthur's side of the bed remained untouched, neatly made out of habit rather than hope. I kept my eyes on the ceiling and wondered when comfort had quietly turned into something conditional. In the morning, sunlight spilled across the bedroom floor, reaching the edge of the dresser where Arthur's watch still rested. It had stopped the day he died. I never wound it again. Some things felt too final to restart. I dressed slowly, my movements careful, as if the house were watching and might object if I moved too fast. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's tea. I rinsed the cup and set it back in the cupboard, noticing how many shelves were already half empty. My son had suggested I start sorting, start letting go. He said it would make things easier later. I was beginning to understand that later meant without me. The realtor called just after breakfast. Her voice was cheerful, efficient, practiced. She spoke about listings and timelines, about staging and curb appeal. I answered politely, saying very little, agreeing to dates that felt abstract and unreal. When the call ended, I sat at the table and folded my hands together, pressing my fingers until the joints ached. Pain, at least, was something I could recognize. The rest of the day passed in small, quiet motions. I watered the plants, wiped down counters that were already clean, stood at the window longer than necessary watching a neighbor load groceries into her car. No one came by, no one checked in. I told myself this was normal. People had lives. Still, the silence felt deliberate, as if the world were politely stepping back while something important was decided without me. In the afternoon, I found myself drawn back to the garden. I told myself it was because the roses needed attention, because the weeds would only grow worse if I ignored them. But I knew that was not the whole truth. My eyes went immediately to the spot near the fence where my knee had brushed against something hidden. The soil looked undisturbed, innocent even. I stood there for a long moment, hands at my sides, feeling foolish for being uneasy about a patch of dirt. Arthur had always believed in leaving things prepared. He was the kind of man who labeled boxes, who kept documents neatly filed, who planned for emergencies that never came. Sometimes I teased him for it. Sometimes I was grateful. Lately, I found myself wondering if there were parts of him I had not fully understood, habits I had overlooked because life was busy and love felt permanent. I knelt again, slower this time, and pulled a few weeds from the edge of the bed, deliberately avoiding the place that held my attention. My back protested, a dull reminder of my age, and I eased myself onto the grass instead. From there, I could see the back of the house clearly, the kitchen window where Arthur used to wave at me when I worked outside. The glass reflected my image now, smaller, more bent, but still me. As I sat there, memories surfaced uninvited. Jason running through the yard as a boy, his shoes muddy, his laughter sharp and bright. Arthur lifting him onto his shoulders, both of them pretending not to hear my warnings about the roses. I wondered when those moments had stopped mattering to him, or if they mattered only as long as they did not complicate his plans. Later that evening, Jason called. His tone was lighter than it had been in weeks, as if a burden had already been lifted. He asked if the realtor had reached out, if I was cooperating. I told him yes. There was a pause, brief but telling, before he thanked me, not for trusting him, not for understanding, only for being reasonable. When the call ended, I stared at the phone in my hand and thought about how easily gratitude had replaced concern. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both rushed and stalled. Appointments were scheduled, papers were mentioned, decisions hovered just out of reach. I moved through it all quietly, nodding when expected, asking few questions. Outwardly, I was compliant. Inwardly, something restless had begun to stir. I started noticing small things I had ignored before, a loose floorboard near the hallway closet, a box on the top shelf of the garage I did not remember packing, Arthur's handwriting on a faded label, careful and precise. I told myself it was natural to look back when change loomed. Still, the feeling that something was slightly out of alignment would not leave me. One afternoon, while sorting through old gardening tools, I found Arthur's gloves. They were stiff with age, the leather cracked, but when I slipped my hand inside one, it fit as if it remembered me. I sat on the step holding them, thinking about how often he had worked beside me without saying much. He believed silence was not empty if it was shared. Later that evening, I dreamed of the garden. In the dream, the roses were taller than they had ever been, their blooms heavy and white, bending towards the ground. I tried to lift them, but my hands passed through the petals as if they were made of smoke. I woke before dawn, my heart steady but alert, the image lingering longer than most dreams do. In the quiet hours before sunrise, I made myself a cup of tea and stood by the back door. The garden lay still beyond the glass, dark and unreadable. I felt a strange pull toward it, not fear exactly, but recognition, as if something there knew my name. I did not dig, not yet. I told myself there was time, that I was imagining patterns where none existed. Still, as the sky lightened and the first birds began to call, I realized that agreeing to sell the house had not quieted anything at all. It had only shifted the silence, concentrating it somewhere deeper. By the end of the week, the house felt like it was waiting. So was I, and between us, beneath the roses, something remained untouched, patient, and very much awake. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a grocery flyer and a utility bill. I almost missed it. The envelope was heavier than the others, cream-colored, my son's name printed neatly in the corner. For a moment, I simply held it, feeling the thickness of the paper, the carefulness of it. Something warm stirred in me before I could stop it. Hope, I realized, still knew my address. Inside was a wedding invitation. Jason and Caroline were planning a renewal ceremony, something modest but elegant, according to the wording, a celebration of commitment, of family. My name was printed beneath the words, "With love." I read that line several times, as if repetition might make it more solid. There was a note enclosed in Jason's handwriting. He said he wanted me there. He said it would mean a lot. He said this was a chance for all of us to start fresh. I sat at the kitchen table with the invitation laid flat in front of me. The afternoon light caught the embossed lettering, making it glow softly. I imagined Arthur standing behind me, reading over my shoulder, smiling the way he did when he wanted me to believe in something. I told myself this was a sign that agreeing to sell the house had softened something, that maybe my son still remembered who I was to him. I called Jason that evening. His voice was distracted, but not unkind. He sounded pleased when I said I would come. He reminded me to dress nicely, said Caroline's family would be there. There was a brief pause before he added that it would be good to show everyone how well things were going. I did not ask what he meant. I did not want to risk the fragile feeling settling in my chest. In the days that followed, I found myself preparing in small, careful ways. I took my blue dress out of the closet, the one Arthur used to like. I pressed it slowly, smoothing each crease, imagining myself sitting among other families, smiling politely, belonging. I even visited the hairdresser, something I had not done since Arthur's funeral. She commented on how nice it was to see me out. I laughed softly and told her it was a special occasion. The house seemed quieter than usual as the day approached. I told myself it was anticipation. I cleaned more than necessary, as if order might spill outward and rearrange things beyond my control. At night, I lay awake thinking about the ceremony, about Jason as a boy, about the possibility that we might speak afterward, really speak, without urgency or resentment. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and cool. I dressed slowly, fastening my necklace with hands that trembled just enough to notice. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw an older woman, yes, but also someone who had lived, who had endured. I straightened my shoulders. Arthur would have wanted that. The venue was a restored hall on the edge of town, surrounded by manicured lawns and white chairs set in neat rows. Everything looked deliberate, curated. I arrived early, unsure where I was meant to be. Caroline's mother greeted me briefly, her smile polite but distant. Jason was busy speaking with someone near the front. I waited for him to notice me. He did not. I took a seat toward the side, smoothing my dress, listening to the low hum of conversation around me. People spoke in hushed tones, laughter rising and falling like waves. I recognized a few faces, old neighbors, distant relatives. Some nodded at me kindly. Others looked through me, already focused elsewhere. When the ceremony began, I watched Jason stand beside Caroline, his posture confident, his expression composed. He looked happy. That brought me a small measure of peace. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that my presence mattered simply because I was his mother, because love did not require justification. After the vows, everyone moved to the reception area. Tables were arranged with careful symmetry, name cards placed precisely. I searched for mine, walking slowly along the rows. When I found it, my steps faltered. My name was at a table near the back, beside people I did not know, far from Jason and Caroline's families. I told myself it was nothing. Seating arrangements were complicated. I sat down quietly. As the meal progressed, speeches began. Caroline's father spoke warmly about family, about support, about standing together through change. Jason followed. He thanked everyone for coming. He spoke about new beginnings, about letting go of the past to make room for the future. His words were measured, rehearsed. I listened carefully, waiting for some small acknowledgement, some thread connecting us. Then he mentioned the house. He spoke lightly, almost jokingly, about how I had finally agreed to sell, how it was for the best. He said it showed growth. Around me, people nodded, some smiled. I felt the room tilt slightly, as if the floor had shifted beneath my chair. My face burned, but I kept my expression still. Jason did not look at me as he spoke. He looked out at the guests, confident, assured. I realized then that this was not a private family matter to him. It was a story, one he controlled. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening as my life was reduced to a convenient example. When the applause came, I joined it softly. I did not want to draw attention. Inside, something tightened, a quiet, steady pressure that had nothing to do with anger. It felt more like clarity, unwelcome but undeniable. As the reception continued, people approached me with sympathetic smiles, offering comments about how hard it must be to let go, how brave I was. I thanked them, my voice even. Each word felt heavier than the last. By the time the music began, I felt oddly detached, as if I were watching myself from a distance. I left early, slipping out without announcement. Outside, the evening air was cool against my face. I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The hope I had carried with me that morning felt thin now, worn down to something barely recognizable. As I drove home, the image of the garden surfaced in my mind unbidden. The spot beneath the roses, the solid shape hidden just out of reach. For the first time, the thought did not comfort me. It unsettled me, because I understood then that whatever waited there might matter more than I had allowed myself to believe, and that I was no longer willing to pretend everything was fine just to keep the peace. I did not tell anyone how I felt after the wedding. There was no one to tell. When I returned home that night, I hung my blue dress back in the closet without looking at it, slid the hanger into place, and closed the door. The house greeted me the way it always did, with stillness, with familiarity, with no questions. I stood in the hallway for a long time, my purse still on my arm, listening to my own breathing slow down. Whatever had cracked inside me at the reception did not make a sound, but it did not repair itself either. The next morning, Jason called as if nothing unusual had happened. He said the ceremony had gone well. He said people were impressed. He asked if I had made it home safely. His voice was polite, almost cheerful. I told him yes. There was a pause, the kind that invites confession, but I said nothing more. He did not ask why I left early. He did not mention his speech. When the call ended, I felt oddly relieved. The absence of apology told me more than any explanation could have. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over me. It was not the heavy loneliness I had known after Arthur died, nor the anxious silence that had accompanied the decision to sell the house. This was thinner, sharper. I moved through my routines carefully, deliberately, as if each action required approval from someone who was no longer present. I cooked simple meals. I washed dishes immediately. I folded laundry the way my mother had taught me, edges aligned, no rush. The realtor came by to take photographs. She commented on the charm of the place, on the natural light, on the potential. I followed her from room to room, answering questions when necessary. When she suggested removing some personal items, I nodded. I did not argue. I watched as Arthur's photograph was moved slightly out of frame, as if his absence needed further confirmation. After she left, I walked through the house again, noting the subtle changes. empty spaces where objects used to be. A chair shifted to improve the angle of a shot. It struck me then how easily a life could be rearranged by someone with a checklist. Jason began stopping by more frequently. He spoke about timelines, about offers, about what would happen once the house sold. He did not ask how I was sleeping. He did not notice how often I sat by the back window now, looking out at the garden without touching it. Each visit felt transactional, efficient. I listened, nodded, agreed. Resistance seemed pointless. I had already given up the argument. One afternoon, Caroline came with him. She walked through the house with a critical eye, commenting on repairs that might increase value, on updates that could appeal to buyers. She spoke kindly enough, but there was an underlying impatience in her tone, as if the house were already an inconvenience. At one point, she suggested turning the garden into something lower maintenance. I felt my jaw tighten, but I said nothing. That evening, after they left, I stood at the back door and stared out at the roses. They were blooming now, white against the dark soil, stubbornly beautiful despite my neglect. I thought about how Arthur had planted them carefully, measuring the distance between each bush, insisting on space. He said they needed room to breathe. I wondered when I had stopped insisting on that for myself. The breaking point did not arrive with drama. It came quietly on an ordinary morning in the form of an envelope. Inside was a preliminary relocation brochure Jason had printed for me. Senior apartments, assisted living options, notes scribbled in the margins about affordability and convenience. There was no question mark anywhere on the page. I sat at the table and read through it slowly. The language was gentle, reassuring, words like community and care and ease. I imagined myself in one of those rooms, walls bare, garden non-existent. The image did not frighten me as much as I expected. What frightened me was how easily I could see it happening, how smoothly my life could be condensed into something manageable for other people. That afternoon, I went to the garden. I did not bring gloves. I did not bring tools. I knelt directly on the ground, feeling the pressure in my knees, the ache in my back. I touched the soil near the roses again, brushing away leaves, exposing the dark earth beneath. My fingers hovered over the spot where I knew something lay hidden. My heart beat steadily, not fast, not slow. I realized then that I was not afraid of what I might find. I was afraid of continuing without knowing. Still, I did not dig. Instead, I sat there and spoke aloud, my voice low. I told Arthur about the wedding, about the speech, about the brochure. I told him how tired I was of being reasonable. The garden listened. The roses swayed slightly in the breeze. Nothing else moved. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the decision not to dig yet felt intentional rather than hesitant. There were things I needed to understand first, about Jason, about myself, about the ways love can change shape without announcing itself. The following day, Jason called again. He said there had been interest in the house. He sounded pleased, almost proud. He spoke about offers as if they were inevitabilities. I listened, my gaze drifting toward the window, toward the patch of garden just out of sight. When he finished, he asked if I had any questions. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. I told him no. That answer seemed to satisfy him. After the call, I remained seated, phone still in my hand, feeling something settle into place. Not resolve, not peace, something firmer. For the first time, I understood that agreeing had not been the same as surrendering, and that whatever waited beneath the roses was only part of what had been buried all along. After that, I stopped reacting. At least that is how it must have looked from the outside. I answered Jason's calls when it suited me. I returned messages without urgency. I nodded during conversations and let silences stretch when they wanted to. It was not indifference, it was conservation. I had spent too long explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was. The house entered a strange in-between state, not quite lived in, not quite abandoned. Some drawers were half emptied, others untouched. Arthur's books still lined the shelves, though a few spaces now gaped where the realtor suggested things be lightened. I moved slowly through the rooms, not with nostalgia, but with attention. I noticed how the floor creaked more near the study, how one window never fully latched, how the hallway closet still smelled faintly of Arthur's coat. These details felt important, though I could not yet say why. Jason's visits became shorter. He seemed satisfied with my compliance. When people get what they want, they often stop looking closely. I made tea when he came. I listened. I asked neutral questions. He filled the quiet with talk of logistics, of progress. He did not notice that I rarely argued anymore. He mistook silence for agreement. At night, I began sorting through papers, not in a rush, one drawer at a time. I sat at the dining table with a small lamp, spreading documents out carefully, reading dates, signatures, notes in Arthur's handwriting. Some things were familiar, others were not. Arthur had always kept certain matters to himself, not out of secrecy, but out of a belief that burdens should be carried lightly when possible. I had loved him for that. Now I wondered what weight he had been holding without me. I did not tell anyone what I was doing, not Jason, not a neighbor, not even the quiet part of myself that wanted reassurance. I simply worked. When I grew tired, I stopped. When my eyes ached, I rested them. There was no deadline. Whatever this was, it had waited years already. During the day, I kept my routine small and predictable. Grocery shopping, a short walk around the block, sitting in the garden without touching the soil. The roses were in full bloom now, their scent faint but steady. Neighbors commented on how nice they looked. I thanked them and said Arthur had planted them. That was true, and it felt important to say his name aloud. One afternoon, while watering the edge of the bed, I noticed how carefully the roses had been arranged, not in the loose way I tended to plant, but in precise spacing, measured and intentional. I had always thought Arthur was simply particular. Now I wondered if there had been more thought in that patch of ground than I had allowed myself to see. Jason called later that day, sounding impatient. He said an offer had come in and that we would need to move quickly if we wanted the best outcome. I told him I understood. He asked if I was ready. I said yes. The word came easily. That surprised me. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table and folded my hands together, the way I had when the realtor first phoned. This time, the ache in my chest was different, quieter, more contained. I thought about how often women my age are told to be grateful for decisions made on their behalf, how cooperation is praised while resistance is treated like confusion. I had been cooperative all my life. I was very good at it. That evening, I took Arthur's gloves from the drawer where I had placed them and carried them outside. I did not put them on. I set them on the bench near the garden and sat beside them. The air was cool. The light was fading. I spoke to Arthur again, not with desperation, but with steadiness. I told him I was paying attention now. I told him I was listening. There are moments when endurance looks like stillness, when preparation looks like waiting. I had reached that place. I was no longer seeking reassurance from Jason, nor approval from anyone else. I was gathering myself quietly, piece by piece. A letter arrived addressed to Arthur, forwarded from somewhere it had been misplaced. It was old, judging by the envelope, the edges softened with time. I did not open it right away. I set it aside and made myself tea. When I finally did read it, I read it slowly, once, then again. I folded it neatly and placed it with the others. I did not cry. Tears would have felt premature. The next day I called the bank, not with urgency, with courtesy. I asked a few simple questions. I listened carefully to the answers. I thanked the woman on the line for her help. When I hung up, I sat very still, absorbing what I had learned. Nothing had changed yet, but something had clarified. Jason came by unexpectedly that weekend. He walked through the house with a sense of ownership that no longer startled me. He commented on the garden again, suggesting it might need professional cleanup before showings. I told him I would handle it. He looked surprised, then relieved. He trusted that I would do what was expected. After he left, I stood in the doorway and watched his car disappear down the street. I did not feel angry. I felt resolved. There is a difference, and it matters. That night I slept with the window open, the scent of roses drifting in. I dreamed of Arthur again, but this time he did not speak. He simply stood at the edge of the garden, watching. When I woke, the feeling stayed with me, calm and insistent. I knew then that the time of observing was nearing an end, that preparation, however quiet, eventually asks to be used. The garden was no longer just a place of memory, it was a threshold, and I was getting closer to crossing it, one careful step at a time. The week before the inspection passed without incident, which in itself felt unusual. Jason did not call. The realtor sent a brief message confirming the date and time, nothing more. The house seemed to hold its breath, suspended between past and future. I moved through it quietly, aware of each sound my body made, each chair pulled out, each cupboard opened and closed. It felt important not to disturb anything unnecessarily, as if the walls were listening. I began waking earlier than usual, before sunrise, before the birds. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and watch the darkness thin at the edges. These mornings felt private, untouched by other people's expectations. In those hours, I felt most like myself, not a problem to be solved or a decision to be managed, just a woman sitting in her own home. I spent more time in the study. It was the one room Jason rarely entered, perhaps because it still felt too much like Arthur. The desk was neat, just as my husband had kept it. I opened drawers slowly, one at a time, examining their contents with care. Receipts, old notebooks, a folder marked in Arthur's handwriting, the ink faded but deliberate. I did not rush. Whatever I was doing required patience more than urgency. Some afternoons, neighbors stopped to chat, drawn by the sight of me outside more often. They spoke about the weather, about local news, about how long I had lived here. When they mentioned the sale, I nodded and said it was a change. I did not elaborate. People accept brevity easily when it comes from someone they consider settled. The garden changed subtly as the days went on. The roses were beginning to shed petals now, white drifting down to the soil like quiet confessions. I collected some in my hands one evening and let them fall again, watching how they blended back into the earth. Arthur had once told me, nothing beautiful is ever truly lost, it simply changes form. At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Now I wondered if he had meant more. Jason came by 2 days before the inspection. He walked through the house briskly, checking off things in his mind. He asked if I had packed essentials yet. I told him I was working on it. He suggested I stay with them once the house sold, at least temporarily. He framed it as generosity. I heard it as assumption. I thanked him anyway. He lingered by the back door, glancing out at the garden. He asked if I planned to do anything about the roses before buyers came through. I told him no. They were Arthur's. That seemed to end the discussion. He left shortly after, satisfied enough. That night, I sat in the living room without turning on the television. I listened to the clock tick. I listened to the faint rustle of leaves outside. I thought about all the times I had mistaken endurance for invisibility, about how often silence is interpreted as absence. I had been present all along. I had simply been quiet. I returned to the papers after dinner, spreading them out again under the lamp. I read the same documents I had already examined, not because I expected them to change, but because repetition brings clarity. Patterns emerged slowly, dates aligned, names repeated. Arthur's careful nature revealed itself, not in grand gestures, but in consistency. I felt a steady gratitude for that, deeper than emotion, closer to trust. At some point, I noticed my hands were no longer shaking. That realization surprised me. Fear had been replaced by something calmer, heavier, responsibility, perhaps, or readiness. I folded the documents and placed them back where they belonged. There was no need to rush what would come next. The night before the inspection, I went into the garden after sunset. I carried a small flashlight, but did not turn it on right away. The air was cool, the ground firm beneath my feet. I stood near the roses, close enough to smell them, far enough not to disturb them. I thought about the way Jason spoke of timelines, of offers, of outcomes. I thought about how none of those words had room for memory. I knelt down slowly, more to prove to myself that I could than because I intended to act. My knees protested, then settled. I placed my hands on the ground, feeling the soil through my palms. I did not dig, I simply stayed there, breathing evenly, letting the moment exist without demanding anything from it. I spoke to Arthur again, quietly. I told him I understood now why he had done things the way he had. I told him I was not angry. I told him I was paying attention. The words felt less like a request and more like a promise. When I stood up, my joints stiff, I brushed the dirt from my hands and went back inside. I slept soundly, dreamless. The inspection came and went the next day. I was present but unobtrusive, answering questions when asked, stepping aside when needed. The inspector commented on the solid structure, on the care the house had received over the years. I thanked him. Pride flickered briefly, then settled. After they left, the house felt strangely intact, as if it had passed a test. I made myself lunch and ate it slowly at the table. Outside, a few rose petals had fallen onto the path. I left them where they were. That evening, Jason called with updates. He sounded pleased. He said things were moving forward. He said this was good news. I agreed. It was, in its own way. After the call, I sat by the window and watched the light fade. The garden lay quiet, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what to look for. I realized then that waiting had never been passive for me. It had been deliberate. Whatever came next would require action, yes, but it would also require calm, and that, I had learned, was something I still possessed, in abundance. It was a Thursday afternoon when I finally decided to return to the garden, to face what I had been avoiding for so long. The sun was low, casting long, soft shadows across the yard. The roses were still blooming, their white petals glowing faintly in the warm light. I knelt beside the bed, hands hovering over the familiar patch of soil, feeling its firmness beneath my fingers. I could no longer postpone this moment. I had prepared quietly, observed meticulously, endured patiently. Now it was time to uncover what had waited for me, hidden but not lost, beneath the surface of my life and the earth alike. I dug slowly, deliberately, my hands pressing into the cool soil. Each scoop revealed more of the dark earth beneath, damp and steady. My mind stayed calm, focused on the rhythm of movement, the sensation of the garden yielding little by little to my touch. I found nothing at first that surprised me, just soil, roots, and small stones. But then, as my fingers brushed against something solid, a chill ran through me, not of fear, but recognition. The edge was smooth, deliberate, not natural. My heart did not race, it simply acknowledged what it had already suspected. It was a small rectangular box, weathered and worn, buried just beneath the surface. I lifted it carefully, brushing soil from the edges, my breath steady, measured. The metal latch resisted slightly, as if it were guarding its contents. I opened it slowly, expecting perhaps a memento, a trinket, something sentimental. What I found was neither. Papers, folded and stacked neatly, their edges yellowed but intact. Documents, official looking, addressed to Arthur, to me, and in places to Jason. My fingers trembled slightly, not from surprise, but from the weight of years and secrecy compressed into thin sheets of paper. I spread them out on the grass beside me. There were deeds, financial statements, letters I had never seen, notes Arthur had made with meticulous care. One sheet caught my attention immediately, a legal amendment that had been filed quietly years before his death, ensuring the house could not be sold without my explicit consent. My breath caught. This was not the impulsive reaction of a panicked woman or a worried mother. This was Arthur, calm and deliberate even in death, preparing for contingencies that I had not been aware of. I had been under no obligation to comply with Jason's demands. Everything he thought he controlled had been, quietly, safeguarded by love. Another document revealed a trust placed under Arthur's name with provisions to protect me should I ever be pressured or coerced. It was detailed, specifying conditions, timelines, and contingencies. The letters enclosed were written to me to be read only if I needed direction, reassurance, or courage. As I unfolded them, I read carefully. Arthur's words were calm, restrained, deliberate. He wrote about love, about boundaries, about the importance of preserving one's dignity. He had anticipated moments like this, understood my hesitation, my desire to avoid conflict. He had prepared me, even in absence, to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I stayed there for hours, sitting among the roses, reading, absorbing, letting each word settle. The garden felt different now, not simply a refuge, but a threshold of clarity. I understood Jason's actions, Caroline's smiles, the way the world had tried to condense my life into something manageable for others. But I also understood that the control had never been theirs to claim. Arthur had ensured that. I was neither helpless nor forgotten. When I finally stood, brushing the soil from my hands, a calm resolve had settled over me. I knew what had to be done, but not yet how. The bank would have to be addressed, the realtor informed, documents would need to be presented, signatures acknowledged. Jason would have to confront reality, not with anger, but with the simple fact that the house and I were not for negotiation. Everything I had endured, observed, and prepared had led to this quiet reckoning. The power was not in Jason's insistence, nor in the legal system alone, but in the careful preservation of truth, the foresight of a husband who understood me better than I had understood myself at the time. I walked back inside, the box tucked carefully under my arm. The house seemed to acknowledge me differently, as if it recognized the shift in its inhabitant. I placed the documents on the dining room table and sat across from them, tea cooling in a cup beside me. For the first time in months, I felt neither desperation nor obligation. I felt authority, calm, quiet, unshakable. Every visit from Jason, every suggestion from the realtor, every expectation from the world outside would now meet a boundary drawn clearly, firmly, with neither apology nor anger. It was simply reality. That evening, Jason called, unaware that the tide had shifted. He spoke of offers, of expediency, of dates and decisions. I listened politely, nodding as if I were still compliant. Inside, I held the documents. I knew the truth. I knew what I could present and when. I allowed him to talk, unaware of the quiet patience accumulating in my hands, in my chest, in the way I sat upright, unhurried, entirely under control of the pace. By nightfall, I returned to the garden, placing the box back beneath the roses, covering it carefully with soil, patting it smooth. The white petals drifted around me like witnesses. The earth was steady, patient, and deliberate, qualities I long undervalued. I understood now that life sometimes waits silently, offering the chance to reclaim what is yours if you only pay attention. The house, the garden, the box, all of it had waited, and I had finally noticed. I stood among the roses and breathed deeply, aware that the next steps would test patience, intelligence, and composure. But for the first time in months, I felt neither fear nor uncertainty. Everything that had been hidden, everything that had been quietly preserved, was mine to bring into the light. And yet I did not act immediately. I left the garden and the documents undisturbed, knowing that the power of revelation is strongest when it comes not in haste, but in quiet, deliberate timing. The anticipation settled into a low hum of readiness, and I finally understood that I was prepared in a way Jason could possibly not have anticipated. The following days unfolded differently, almost imperceptibly at first. Jason arrived as usual, carrying the confident air of someone who believed he was in control. I welcomed him politely, offered tea, answered his questions about showings and offers. He did not notice the subtle shift in my demeanor, the calm in my voice that no longer sought approval. He mistook my patience for compliance, my silence for weakness. He had underestimated how quietly resolute I had become. The day came when I decided to bring the documents to the bank. I dressed carefully, deliberately, in clothes that felt like armor without being ostentatious. The roses outside the window reminded me of the garden and what lay beneath it, but I did not think of them as a warning. I thought of them as witnesses. Every step toward the car, toward the bank, was measured, grounded. I had rehearsed nothing aloud, but every motion had been prepared in my mind. At the bank, the process was formal, tedious even, but entirely predictable. The teller and I spoke in calm tones. I presented the papers one by one, explaining their significance only as necessary. They verified signatures, checked dates, examined clauses. I did not falter. There was no room for emotion, though internally I felt a quiet satisfaction, a kind of liberation I had never anticipated. The house that Jason had assumed would be negotiable was now legally untouchable without my explicit consent. The weight of years of anticipation, endurance, and quiet observation settled finally into proof. When I returned home, I did not call Jason. I did not announce victory. I simply went through my day as usual, tending to the roses, straightening books, making a cup of tea. The difference was subtle but undeniable. The house now responded to me. The walls felt attentive rather than burdensome. The rooms seemed to acknowledge that their occupant had reclaimed authority. Even the furniture, worn with age, seemed to settle more comfortably around me. Jason did call later that afternoon. His voice carried a tone of impatience, mild surprise, a hint of defensiveness. He asked if everything had gone smoothly with the bank, if I understood the next steps. I listened carefully. I did not explain. I did not argue. I waited for the right moment, the right words, and then I reminded him that the house could not be sold without my authorization. I did so calmly, without drama, without accusation. The pause on the other end of the line was long, almost fragile. Then his tone shifted to one of practicality. He accepted the fact, though it was clear he had not expected it, that he could not move forward as he had assumed. The days that followed were quiet, though the tension in the air lingered. Jason visited less frequently, his assumptions about compliance dismantled quietly but completely. Caroline did not call. The realtor's messages were polite but distant. The house was no longer a battleground of persuasion and subtle coercion. It was simply home, lived in by someone who understood its value beyond money or convenience. I spent more time in the garden than I had in months. The roses had started to shed their petals fully, but I paid them no mind. The soil felt steady beneath my hands. The box remained buried beneath the earth, a silent testament to preparation, foresight, and love preserved over time. I did not need to retrieve it to feel its presence. I understood now that the act of knowing it existed, the act of understanding its power, was enough to redefine every interaction, every expectation, every attempt to control me. Neighbors noticed the shift too. They commented subtly, in passing, about how much more composed I seemed, how the house appeared serene, maintained yet unhurried. I did not explain. I did not need to. The lesson was not for them. It was for me, and for anyone who might have assumed that age or loneliness made a person pliable, that quiet endurance was weakness, or that compliance could be demanded without respect. Even at night, the house felt different. I sat by the window, the faint moonlight glancing off the roses, the shadows stretching long across the yard. I thought about Jason, about the lessons he had learned without realizing it. I did not feel triumph in the way people expect. I felt clarity. I felt the satisfaction of integrity preserved, of boundaries established, of dignity intact. And I understood finally that the battle, if it could be called that, had never been about confrontation. It had been about patience, observation, quiet intelligence, and trust in what had been left for me to discover. I did not speak of revenge. There was no need. The knowledge I carried, the quiet strength I had cultivated, and the careful preparation Arthur had left behind accomplished more than anger or confrontation ever could. The house, the garden, the box beneath the roses, all of it was now aligned with the life I had chosen, with the autonomy I had reclaimed. And yet, even in the calm of understanding, a low, subtle tension remained, not of fear, but of awareness. Life does not release entirely, even when truth is quietly revealed. The world continues to shift around you. People continue to make assumptions. But for the first time in years, I felt the distinction between expectation and reality so clearly that no one else could shake it. I could act if necessary, but I did not need to act impulsively. The revelation had given me what patience alone cannot manufacture: certainty. I closed the window that night, letting the house settle once again into quietude. I knew Jason would eventually learn fully the limits of his authority, but that lesson would come in its own time. For now, the house, the garden, and I existed in a state of calm reclamation. I walked through the rooms slowly, observing, noting, absorbing. The boundaries had been drawn, the control had been reclaimed, the quiet aftermath was mine to inhabit, fully, deliberately, without apology or expectation. The roses swayed gently in the moonlight, and for the first time I allowed myself to believe in the permanence of that peace. Years have passed since that revelation, and the house has settled into a rhythm all its own. I walk through it each day with deliberate attention, noticing the way the light moves across the floors, how the walls catch sounds differently now that tension no longer lingers in the corners. The roses bloom every spring, abundant and unhurried, their petals falling quietly onto the soil beneath, reminders of patience, endurance, and the life carefully preserved beneath their roots. I tend them without haste, without expectation, simply observing how something so fragile can persist and thrive when given care. Jason visits rarely, and when he does, his manner has changed. He is polite, even cordial, but the assumption of authority that once defined our interactions is gone. I answer his questions calmly, offer guidance without yielding, speak clearly without needing to justify my choices. There is no anger, no resentment, only the quiet confidence of someone who understands her rights and her worth. He has learned gradually that control cannot be imposed where boundaries have been firmly established, that compliance is earned, not commanded, and that respect cannot be bypassed. I live now without the constant tension that used to shadow every conversation, every decision. I wake in the mornings with no one's expectations weighing on me, no subtle pressures guiding my choices. My days are filled with small, deliberate routines, tending the garden, reading letters I still keep from Arthur, walking through the neighborhood at my own pace, and occasionally sipping tea by the window as sunlight shifts across the living room. The house feels expansive again, not because it is larger, but because it is mine in every sense that matters. The box beneath the roses remains untouched, a quiet sentinel of foresight and love. I do not need to open it. Its presence is enough, a constant reminder that preparation and patience can preserve dignity and security even when the world seems determined to strip them away. I sometimes touch the soil above it with my fingers, feeling its steady, unspoken reassurance. There is no thrill, no drama, only the deep comfort of knowing that what was hidden was never lost, only waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. I have learned to recognize the difference between kindness that strengthens and kindness that erodes. I have learned that love does not demand surrender, and that boundaries are not cruelty, they are survival. The house, the garden, the quiet moments of observation and endurance all have taught me this lesson in ways words never could. Arthur's guidance, even from beyond, remains a gentle compass, clear, steady, unyielding in its wisdom. The world outside continues, as it always does, filled with expectations, demands, and assumptions. I no longer resist entirely, I simply navigate it differently. I choose what matters, what deserves my energy, and what can pass without notice. Loneliness visits sometimes, but it is tempered by choice, by the knowledge that solitude is not weakness and that independence carries its own dignity. I am not beholden to anyone, nor do I need anyone to validate my existence. The house, the garden, the life I have cultivated all exist as extensions of that truth. Every spring, when the roses bloom white and full, I pause to remember the path that brought me here. The wedding I left early, the speeches that spoke of progress while ignoring truth, the quiet observation that became preparation, and the patient endurance that led to revelation. I remember how fear and compliance once threatened to dictate my life, and I feel the subtle triumph of quiet intelligence, of measured action, of self-respect reclaimed. There is no bitterness, no desire for revenge. There is only clarity, calm, and a deep sense of completion. I live now fully in the moment, aware of the beauty, the fragility, and the persistence of life around me. The house is no longer a prison of memories, nor a site of negotiation. It is a sanctuary, a home in the truest sense, earned through observation, patience, and courage. I tend the roses, I walk the rooms, I sip tea in the evenings, and I know that the dignity I fought to preserve is intact, unshakable. The past is present only as a teacher, never as a burden. Jason's lessons were learned quietly in the spaces where he assumed control could reside, but where preparation and patience had already rewritten the terms. Caroline's smiles, the offers, the brochures, all have faded into irrelevance. What remains is mine, a life lived on my own terms, a home where I am fully acknowledged, and the quiet, steady presence of love and foresight that guided me here. And so I sit in the garden, the white roses around me, petals drifting to the soil like whispered confirmations of endurance. The house behind me is still, content in its ownership, echoing nothing but the calm of my existence. I have discovered that freedom is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, deliberate, and absolute. I am finally, wholly, unshakably myself. The past has shaped me, but it no longer confines me. The garden blooms, The house breathes, and I exist fully, peacefully, with every choice, every boundary, every quiet victory, finally mine.